Okay, so the next speaker is Norman Badler. I am super excited to have Norm here today. Norm was my PhD advisor, so to me it's really an honor that you accepted the invitation to come join us here and give your talk. So Norm, for those of you that don't know him, he's one of the pioneers simulating virtual humans. I think he's worked in all areas of a virtual humanoid, including attention, gestures, gaze, behavior, animation, and crowd simulation. So Norm, in the mid-90s, he was the person behind the Jack software, which was one of the first tools to have a virtual human that you could use for ergonomic purposes mostly. He's been for many years a professor in computer graphics at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was the founding director of the Center for Digital Visualization, the Center for Computer Graphics, and the Center for Human Modeling and Simulation. He has supervised more than 62 PhD students. I have the number correct, Norm? Yeah, well, I was one of them. That's exciting. He's the co-author of 5 books. 3 of them were my fault, I believe, Norm. I dragged you into it. And since he retired about 6 years ago, I think he lasted a couple of days retired before he joined Cesium to be the head of the metaverse research there. And just one last thing, in 2021, he received, or he was named ACM SIGGRAPH's Academy class, which is one of the highest honors in the field of computer graphics. So I think there's many more things I could say about him, but you can find them online because there is a gigantic list of achievements in his career. So I'm going to leave him with the presentation, and thanks again for coming, Norm.
Well, thank you so much, Nuria. It is truly an honor to be here, especially because I'm very fond of talking to PhD students. So I'm roughly dividing this into 4 very unequal parts, and I'll try to make sure that I stay on time. So first I'd like to talk a bit, mostly at a high level. So unlike the details from Taku's talk, for example, I'm going to stay largely at a higher level to try to capture a few things I've learned or realized over my career. So secondly, I'm going to talk about my research origins, because I think everyone has their own way of approaching research, and I think what I've come from is at least instructive. Then I will dive a little bit into, in depth into parameterized models, and tell you from the beginning that I'm old school because mostly we do not use machine learning models, and I'll tell you why. And then I like to end with what I think is the fun part, which is coming back to the high level, and I think well within the themes of the workshop, to talk about reconstructing and repopulating ancient societies. So let's start with the virtual human taxonomy. I've seen a few, but I'm going to give you my take on this in 3 dimensions: visual realism, personal familiarity, and personal history or motivators. And rather than read all that to you, let me give you the graph. These boxes clearly overlap a lot, but if you look at applications of virtual humans, they span all the way from pretty well-known NPCs in games to, again, well-known avatars. But there are certain dimensions where the problems become difficult. And this morning we saw one of those actually very well on the upper left, that a known persona or a celebrity is challenging because of the visual realism that's necessary to portray them. But if you move that into trying to create a persona that you know really well, like your companion, your partner, your spouse, I think those problems are almost well beyond the present capability of our field. There are pretty good successes in virtual teammates, in games, and collaborators, and in military simulation. Virtual influencers are, in my mind, surprisingly not that difficult, because they only talk to you. You don't interact with them typically. So this taxonomy helps me set what sort of things I want to get to today. And in particular, the one that I'm going to reach out to at the end is this purposeful populace. So virtual realism is important. Familiarity is not important, but what goes in here is a lot of the background material about why these people are doing what they do and the motivators for why they're doing it. So in a way, this isn't even truly a graphics talk. Ultimately, it's about building models of communities. Another way to look at this without belaboring the graphics too much is, the virtual influencer, they just have to project out to an audience, whereas collaborators, teammates, even NPCs to some extent, and these other more challenging individuals that we know require a lot of techniques that are not well established in the community. We know how to do 3D design. There was a very good question with Taku about variation, and that's important. If you have a friend, they probably are not wearing the same clothes every day, so the variation is within some constrained space. But you share personal history and shared experience. That gives you something to talk about. I don't see any realistic way right now of building that into a model. So one of the things I will talk to today is work that was done by a number of colleagues, and I think is instructive for its methodology dealing with personality. And the one thing I won't do much about today is dealing with decision making, but I will talk about roles and responsibilities. So I'm going to touch on some of these areas that I think are the difficult ones, because that's where research lies. So this basically summarizes what I said, and one of the things about retiring a year and a half ago is I no longer have to do these things. So I don't mind telling people these are open problems. But I really think there's a role in creating an agent backstory, a reason for that agent to exist, and therefore a basis to interact with it. We've certainly worked with a few aspects of that, but I don't see any comprehensive approach to that. And likewise, in return, I don't see any way of informing those avatars or agents that we interact with, of informing them about our own backstory. Okay, what do I want that?
Sorry, I think the pages are not changing for the people online, the slides.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean they're not changing
There
live?
are some people wrote in the chat that the slides are not changing.
Ah,
They're not seeing this one right now? They are using.
can you see that? Yeah, that's it.
It's changing here but not online?
No, I think not online.
Ah,
Just
shall I wait?
continue. No, wait.
So, okay.
Yeah, maybe that.
Lost the internet.
No, I yeah. Oh, they're just seeing.
So a different window is being shared.
Yeah, it's a different window.
Okay.
This is good or not good?
We'll fix it, yeah. They're sharing a different window, I'm not sure.
It's
how
on
that
this one.
happened. That's what I think they're seeing, yeah,
It didn't advance.
not the whole screen. Can you or something?
Sure,
Puedes hacer más
yeah.
pequeño.
Do you want me to use my laptop?
No, ya, exacto. Puedes poner algo más pequeñito, cambiarlo el tamaño.
Now it's fine, yeah, now it works.
Exacto. No, de arriba no se puede ir en Zoom, si no déjalo, venga. Lo que pasa es que déjalo. Okay,
Are we good? Okay, well that's an appropriate place to mention that all of these lead into very interesting ethics issues that that I won't address today, but Sergey actually touched on them this morning, and I think they are serious issues. And again, an area of research is, what do I know about the virtual person I'm interacting with, both from their actions, but also what I know from their past, and then what do they know about me through my actions and through my past. So there's been a lot of work on sensing the facial expressions, the emotion, There are questions of the ethical basis for that, but I don't see many people asking about what they should know about me. And clearly a lot of that information is being collected by Facebook and TikTok and all that. So there are some comprehensive issues there that should be addressed. All right, so that's kind of where I set the work. I guess it's fair to say I've worked in most of those boxes, if you recall the image. But one of the reasons that I've been able to do that is that as a researcher, I've kept, I think, two very important missions in mind. One is to ask research questions that are too big to answer. Right? It's very easy, and especially as you do your PhD, and you should be involved in some in-depth in a topic, but once in a while, step back and ask yourself, what's the really big question you'd like to answer? And one of them that motivated me for almost 2 decades was to get virtual humans to follow and execute instructions. Okay, it's one of the hardest things when you have children to get them to listen. Some of you will understand what that is. It's even harder to get a virtual human to understand and listen. And this was the motivation a lot for the JAC human modeling work that we pretty much finished in the mid-90s. During that time and for the next 20 years or so, I became a little more interested in broader questions of how do we embed cognition, awareness, attention, individualization into virtual humans, knowing that I couldn't ever do all of it, but those were all parts of making a whole, making a gestalt that was virtual human. And even bigger than that, how would I simulate the community? A community of interacting, socially engaged individuals where their interactions were meaningful in some way. The second part of that was a breadth of interests which looks way too big, but I have always been energized by finding things that other communities know. So very early on, my first colleague was interested in ballet, and his girlfriend was a ballerina. So we became very interested in movement languages, movement notations. In order to get money for research projects, our virtual human was the first interactive model, and so we got many grants for human factors, which led to research in IK and locomotion and collision avoidance. Having one model led to the idea of having an embodied agent that then had a face and gesture, like you saw with Taku's work. And of course, multiple of those into crowds. The ability to follow directions led to an interest in natural language. It turned out natural language research was the reason I got my PhD, because I ran into an individual whose work actually fit the framework I was articulating, but I didn't have the vocabulary for. So natural language really helped me get my PhD and became a backbone for my research for many years. I collaborated with every natural language researcher at Penn on a number of topics. From the perception and computer vision side, we worked on attention and eye movement and sound perception. And finally, I'm a computer scientist. So I actually had my PhD in computer science, actually in computer vision, but in order to do the computer vision, I had to build an animation system. And at that time, I didn't think that was important enough to describe, but it actually was the fun part of it. So the main point here is to not be afraid of your other interests. And not be afraid to talk to people outside of your own close-knit community, because very often they have ideas and representations and formulations that are important because they've been observing and thinking, but they may not have the computational resources to build on. So let me talk then about movement representation. and this is exactly following from that history. My first rule, pretty much, is discover what other people know. Right? Other people, have accused me of being a dilettante, working in human factors when I didn't have a degree in human factors and biomechanics. But I went to the sources, I went to the experts, I studied what they did, and I learned about what they knew and what they didn't know. And that's a very useful way of informing your own work. So for example, we started with lab annotation, which was a very kinematic way of describing what a dancer was doing or what a person in a factory was doing. And we quickly found out that there were some limitations, and the experts who worked in this area actually figured out that there were limitations as well. So they built another system called effort shape or Laban movement analysis. And the problem with this is that it was highly descriptive. It told you how a movement was performed, but there was no computational basis. So the best example of lab annotation is if someone says, she made a threatening gesture. Well, you don't know what the gesture was, but you do know that however it was done, it was threatening. Okay? That's my best example. And lab annotation was designed to capture this how and not the what, right? So nobody had any idea what to do with that realization, and in fact there were some questions of whether it even made sense. So a really quick summary of what LMA is. In general, there are two categories. There are efforts, which is the how, and there's the shape. But the shape was a global measure, so we're not usually thinking about shape in graphics, especially in rigged motion, but shape is about the whole body. Am I getting bigger? Am I getting smaller? Am I sitting up or sinking down? Okay. So they use these words. Actually, the words in English are probably poor translations from the original German, and in German they were still words that were used to describe qualities. And what we realized is that these words were replacements for perceptual qualities. So an LMA notator would watch a movement and it would trigger some of these words, and then that would be what they used to describe the motion. So we knew about LMA probably in 1977 or 76, and it was really almost 25 years later that we had our first computational realization of this system. It was a PhD student, Diane Chi. She built a complete model of LMA called Emote. It was published in SIGGRAPH 2000. And Diane hand-built all the motion transformations, but to her credit, it wasn't a one-off system. It involved turning all the LMA features into parametric controls. So we used this for a lot of different applications, and it was a very powerful system. So we could portray different speaker attitudes by twiddling the LMA knobs. We could use it to portray adverbs like hit with different degrees of force. There's no physics in that simulation. We used it to portray American Sign Language. Sign languages are very interesting because they're languages, but they're all movement and there's no sound. So there are signs for things, but verbs, like nouns, but verbs come out to be motions, and changes in motions are adverbs. So we were able to do the adverbial changes with Emote. We applied this to facial motion. One of my disappointments in this is I think this had great promise, but Mayran Byun, who'd done the work, had to leave her PhD program for family reasons, and then we dropped it. We used it for motion capture segmentation, and we actually did some neural net recognition of Emote. So this is one of my other students doing sort of arbitrary motions, but what you're getting are the qualities of the motions detected in real time from neural networks that were trained on the Emote parameters. So yes, we did a little machine learning. All right, so this was all very nice in the early 2000s. but there were some gaps. First of all, as computer scientists, it was nice to say we did it, but we had no idea whether it was perceptually valid or not. So validity was a big question that I didn't test. We lacked some generality. We could apply this to keyframe-like motions, but the work that you just saw with the real-time detection with motion capture started to present some challenges. And perhaps the biggest one is LMA itself, because you and I in our daily lives do not describe motion in LMA terms. So these verbal descriptions didn't really lend to a parameterization for anyone that made sense. So I don't even know at this point who realized it, but we decided that the way to gain access to those parameters was through personality. And we chose personality rather than emotion because personality is a relatively long duration human characteristic. Personality basically has a lifetime of at least days, if not years. So it's a relatively stable characteristic of human. So now this was from 2000 to 2014, sort of. So almost 15 years. We revisited the whole basis upon which we did the LMA to motion transformation. And one of my students, especially, my postdoc, Funda Darupanar, spent a year with us and developed Perform. This was published at ACM TOG and presented at SIGGRAPH in 2017. So the goal here was to start with personality and use that to modify a given motion, very much like the original conception of LMA, which is you had the what, you had a motion, but you could change the how. You could change how it was performed. So in order to set this on a much better computational foundation, we wanted to hit a few requirements. It should be described formally in a quantitative fashion so that we could actually build a program that did it. It needed to be well grounded in empirical evidence. It should work for any source motion, no matter where it came from. It should be parametrically variable. In other words, it should be continuous. We didn't want to just have one character, one motion, a fixed transformation. And finally, what was very important for this, it had to be perceptually valid. We needed to actually run experiments to make sure we were doing things that were meaningful and perceptually validated. All right, so to go from personality to motion, the big realization was basically you can't do it, or we didn't think you could do it in one step. Now the reason for putting this in bold here is that the tendency nowadays, and not to be critical, but it's just a strategy that researchers take, is to go from a problem to a solution with one big neural net solution, or a convolutional network. And indeed, we could have done that, but we didn't have a big enough data set that would have made that sensible. So instead, we did the good old computer science thing, is divide it into two separate mappings and compose the mappings. So in order to do this, we needed a representation for personality, and we needed a representation for motion. And in between, we put Laban movement analysis. So for personality, there are many representations. The most common and sort of explanatory one is the ocean personality, which rates people along openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism dimensions. And the motions that we want to use could be from any source: the motion capture, synthesis, gesture libraries, emotion generators, key pose, as long as it was on a rigged figure. And LMA was the intermediate. So in order to derive two mappings, it's a busy slide, but I'm going to chop it up in just a minute. We want to go from personality to motions, but we want to go through LMA. So the first thing we do is we use experts to derive a mapping from the LMA set of parameters into motions. And here we actually used experts. They sat at a user interface for hours on end and derived these expert mappings because they understood what they were looking at. So that's where we necessarily needed experts. The other part of the transformation was from personality to LMA. And here we used crowdsourcing. We used Amazon Mechanical Turkers to build that personality to LMA transformation. And one of the things that Funda and our colleagues did was come up with a very clever way of doing that, so the Turkers had no idea that they were actually working with personality or LMA. And I'll describe that briefly. So now you have two transformations, and they simply get composed. So that's why I say LMA is an intermediate transformation. And in the final animation system, one doesn't even really see LMA at all, except that you're given dials that you can control to vary the motion. The personality to motion parameter study was then validated by showing Amazon Mechanical Turkers different characters and different motions and asking them to see if they differentiated the personality types. Okay, because if it didn't give any differentiation, then we were doing something wrong. So we used a significantly extended set of motion parameters at the low end. So although we were working on a rigged figure, the kinds of low-level motion parameters were almost not low-level at all. So there were things like, if you're a cartoonist, you know about anticipation and overshoot. Overshoot is I reach for something, I go too far, and I back up a little bit. There were a number of frequency and magnitude issues and curvature. So these were all, in a way, they're high-level motion parameters, but they were the low-level targets for the animation system. The trickier part was, how do we characterize personality? Because we didn't want to give personality tests to people. And so it turns out that there is a very efficient quiz or test that you can give someone that transforms words into the ocean personality type. So you're given just 10 questions, and those 10 questions test whether you're extroverted or enthusiastic or critical and quarrelsome, for example. And you have a valenced response, so you know where you are on that scale of each dimension. And what this does then, it gives us a set of words that we can show to a crowdsourced Turker to stand in for personality types. It was a very clever observation that our team had. It's not mine. All right, so the way that Perform worked is we had the adjustable LMA dials, which were the 4 efforts and 4 shapes. We used the experts to build the transformation from LMA to motion parameters, and we used the Turkers to find the presets for personality to LMA. We then wrapped this in a little preprocessor that actually looked at the motions, and that's what Perform was. So now we had a system where you could input the 5 ocean personality models, like I want an extroverted neurotic character. You could input any motion from any source, and you would get a personality modified output. So there's, let's see if I have time. Yes, okay, so I'll give you part of the video just to give you an idea of the user interfaces that were involved. So for the experts, they saw a system like this where they could, at their leisure, work through all of the motion parameters that they wanted to modify in order to achieve what they believed the LMA quality meant in that motion. So they could play with this for as long as they wanted until they felt that that motion was good to represent, a strong, indirect, free motion, whatever that would mean. So that was the expert side. The Amazon Mechanical Turkers saw the personality to LMA, but what they saw was actually words. So which character looks more extroverted, and which one looks more can't remember what the word is. Which one looks more calm, let's say. And so they would pick which animation they thought best represented it. So we built the two transformations that way, and now we could compose them. So if we want a character that looks neurotic, for example, there were then settings from LMA that would give those motion qualities to the character. So if we just randomly assign personalities to characters, we can create variation. The final study was the crowdsourced perceptual one. Which character looks more open, which one looks less open. That's not the words that are there. I can't read them fast enough. But they could then say, which character they thought had that personality type. And it turned out that there was some very strong correlations that were able to validate that motion. So let me just show you one example. And actually, I would like to fast forward through it, but I'm just going to let it play and then I'll talk over it. So this is a motion capture directly out of the CMU database. And this is the same animation if you say, I want the character to be extroverted, neurotic, and those transform into LMA terms, and those affect the motion parameters, okay? So what happens is he moves smoothly, he moves a little faster, he spreads out more, and his movements are free. There's more like overshoot, right? Now, if you change the parameters to be introverted and stable, then these motions sort of come in a little bit. He holds on to the motions a little longer. It's a little choppier, and the movements don't have as wide a range. His head doesn't move as much. And I like to joke, this is probably more like the way I would move, because I just feel a little constrained if I'm moving around. So if you look at these two from the same original motion capture, there's quite a bit of difference in how they actually get performed. And if you asked someone, which character looks more extroverted and which is more introverted, you probably would get a pretty unambiguous response of which is which. And this is just I'll let this play out, showing all three together. They actually end at different times. There's no requirement that they end. The extrovert, because he's moving faster, ends first. The introvert actually is slower and ends a little later than the base animation. So I think that's almost, yep, the extrovert just ended, the base animation ended, and finally the introvert ends. All right, so that was real fun work. It's now like 5 or 6 years old. Funda was a great partner, and we had a few other faculty that worked with us, like Michael Neff. We really appreciated his involvement. All right, so we didn't use machine learning. Well, the main reason is I'm really old-fashioned. I grew up in the early days of AI, and I really like to know how and why my representations work. And that doesn't say that machine learning buries them all, but sometimes it does. And in this, I had a very clear handle on what the representations were doing. The other more realistic reason is that we had no way of obtaining a large motion capture annotated data set to learn from, and therefore we required our experts to hand build all the motion transformations, and we think that worked out just fine. Okay, so now the last part, which in a sense is the fun part, it's the recent part, and it's the higher level part, is putting everything together to try to reconstruct ancient cultures. Now, one could also reconstruct contemporary cultures, but ancient cultures have some other interesting problems of sometimes not knowing. So we actually started this work under a funded project at the beginning of 2010. Now these folks in this marketplace, they're not just wandering around. Each one actually has a grocery list, a shopping list. And they're required to visit the different vendors to obtain the items on their shopping list. Of course, it's a crowd simulation, you know, there's collision avoidance, there's goal seeking, but they have missions, right? And so they seem apparently, although no one ever picks anything up in this early animation, they actually have goals that they are supposed to satisfy. So how are you going to create a community or a meaningful group? So there's a lot of history in my group, and Nuria's been part of that. She really got us started in this area in ways that are really fundamental. But we didn't just want to create crowds of pedestrian, but we wanted to create functional groups that had that were easy to create and modify, and that had some reason for existence. Now, in the case of work with Nuria, very often the reason for existence was to get out of a building. And that's okay. That's a very important reason. And some of my colleagues since then have still worked in that area. We were also interested in building programmable systems for these agents. And another, one of my PhD students, Alex Schulson, who now works at Ubisoft, I believe, was early on building parameterized behavior trees. Now they call this, you know, visual networks and blueprint and things like that to encode the behaviors of agents. We were also interested in creating smart events. So if you wanted something to happen, it would basically coerce or co-opt agents into doing those things for you. So instead of programming the agent, you program the events, and that draws the agents into the activity. It was very interesting way of reversing the roles of what you're programming, and eventually it led to Jan Albeck's Carosa system. And some of that then led, because we're dealing with events, to planning. And that work was part of Schulzen's PhD thesis, and also work that my postdoc, Mubashir Kapadia, took on. And some of that was done in collaboration with Disney Research. So all of this was to try to get meaningful groups readily accessible to a user community. And there's a long list of work that comes out of our lab, and I'm going to apologize for not listing the long list of work from other labs, but we went all the way sort of from pedestrians into high-level, event-driven, animated crowds. And the last work that came out of my group was crowds that actually responded to thermal and density constraints. So one thing about a crowd is one tends to think that they're moving, but what if you have a crowd that's not moving, they have no goals, but you turn up the heat in the room, okay? Or you turn off the heat and they get cold. And what will happen is you'll get spontaneous movement. Okay, if they're hot, they might seek to go to cooler places. If they're cold, they might move closer together. So this is my favorite paper that got rejected 4 times, but eventually I thought it was really nice where I did this with Soraya Moose from Brazil and other people there, and it was eventually published. So in the intervening years, sort of the last 5 years or so, what we found is we almost never have to build renderers anymore. We just exploit game engines. We wanted to build communities, and the best way of doing that was to look at ancient societies, because there we had some motivation to do that. And because I was no longer getting research funds, I started engaging undergraduate students. My last PhD student graduated in 2017, so I no longer had a steady stream of folks who needed theses. So that's okay, because undergraduates are differently skilled in many cases than PhD students, and you have to think in sort of smaller chunks of work, which is also nice. So I'm going to give you 2 case studies. I think we have time, yeah. From South America. The reason for that is my collaborator was a South American archaeologist. But I'm going to first show you 2 different, quite different studies. One is Bauris, which is a culture that thrived in the Amazon, which has interesting environmental issues. And the other is an Inca ceremonial site called Pachacamac. So all of this work was done some of it was led by my last PhD student, Alin Normoyle, who I have huge respect for, is now a professor at Bryn Mawr College. But almost all of the work was done by undergraduates, and it was all motivated by my long-term collaborator with an anthropologist. So this is coming back to my theme of go to other experts. And Clark was actually the curator of the South American section in the Penn University Museum. So for about 15 years, we taught a course with undergraduates, many of whom were freshmen. Often fewer than half were engineers. And we actually taught them to model in Maya, and some learned to do motion capture, and a few even tackled Unreal. Our emphasis was on not telling them what was hard. So we just taught them Maya and just said, you're going to learn this tool. And all the models that were built were hand-built in Maya. We did no 3D scanning. If you go to a museum, everybody's doing 3D scanning, but if you learn how to do 3D modeling, you have a real appreciation for detail and what's going on. And we use that as a basis for summer research projects as well. So this is a paper that I was pleased to present at Symposium on Virtual and Augmented Reality at SIBGRAPHI, which is the Brazilian Computer Graphics Society. So this was 2018. And all of the work here was done by undergraduates. So Clark got top billing because he was the one who set us on this path. But Amelia, Josh, Yusuf, and Mabel were all undergraduates. So a lot of this is really because of their dedication to this project. So first of all, where is Bauruss? Bauruss is in the Amazon. So Bolivia is a country, landlocked country in South America. The Andes are the mountain range to the west, and the Amazon is this broad plain. And what's interesting about the Amazon is its environment where half of the year it's underwater in the spring, and half of the year it's dry because all that water drained off in the Amazon basis. And what's surprising is that the people who live there actually learned how to control that environment in order to survive year-round, including having adequate food. They ate plants and fish, primarily. So what we wanted to do was recreate the everyday environment and artifacts of this cultural group, which basically no longer exists. When Europeans came to South America, they basically did not kill off the people overtly, but they brought diseases which did. So the cultural groups are mostly lost. And we wanted to give our students appreciation for historical accuracy. We didn't want to build, a first-person shooter. We wanted them to think about choices that they make and make informed decisions. And a lot of those informed decisions were about issues that are very contemporary, issues of roles, appearance, and stereotypes. So we were constantly saying, well, why would you, assume a woman would do that job? And why would you assume that they were dressed a certain way, or they had Western hairstyles? They had their own way of doing appearance, and so we were sensitizing them to those things. And all of this, of course, was built in a game engine so that it could be a VR experience as well. So a little bit more on images. Unreal was really a useful choice because it made it easy to show the flooding. So this is the flat Amazon region that is flooded in the springtime. And in order to deal with that, the Bauruss excavated canals and conduits, places that they could walk between the forest islands. So the forest islands were lush with vegetation, and again, in the interest of accuracy, these were not arbitrary plants. They were 3D models, mostly obtained online, of plants that were indigenous to the region. So the flora is even accurate. Unreal was great for that. We were able to teach our students about procedural design. So this is a procedural thatched house. Could vary the layout and the size procedurally, and you'll see in a moment that this was used to create a small village very efficiently. The people themselves, of course, were procedurally animated. So this is one of the female models. Her clothing was taken from colonial era artifacts and drawings. To be honest, most of the time they weren't wearing clothes, but this is more politically correct, and it's fine to do. And there's a male in a dugout canoe. Of course, they made their own canoes. So the communities were small villages with these thatched houses, and the artifacts that were used and the basketry and all that was modeled off of actual objects in the Penn Museum. So we literally took the students in, they picked objects, and they modeled those from photographic records. So it's a very interesting experience to actually get your hands on some of this material and look at how it was made close up, and then have to go back and model it in Maya. Of course, we did some motion capture, and I'd like to show you the result of that. So this was made by the students in one summer. The soundtrack is authentic Amazon recordings. So these earthworks were built to retain water in the dry season, and if you look in the middle, there's a fish trap. So when it got dry, you could catch fish because they want to get out, but they they swim into the trap. The causeways were built to trade and traverse the forest islands. So they would not flood, they would be above the floodplain. And because they were excavated on both sides, there were channels where canoes could be poled or oared between the islands, and goods could be transferred over water. The only thing wrong with this is the water is never that clear, it's very muddy. But in Unreal, you can at least show the water. So there's some more people fishing with authentic baskets and rowing canoe model. Doing the rowing motion capture was very challenging. Okay, and then you see the forest island with the community with these procedurally built thatched houses. It's a very warm climate, so there are no walls really. They're very open. Later, but not in this particular movie, we had a lot of interior details that were built, including hassocks and fish drying racks and all that. But this was the end of the summer. The sad part about this is after the movie was made, someone accidentally erased all the data from the computer that was stored on, and every bit of it was completely lost. And so this is a good argument for Sergey to have decentralized data stores. It was unfortunate. But at least they made the movie. And the primary work here, these are all undergraduates, and some summer undergraduates as well. So we're very, very pleased with that result, but it didn't do as much for crowds. So the second one that I'll talk about relatively quickly as well is one that crowds were critically important for, and this was a Inca site on the Pacific coast near Lima, Peru, called Pachacamac. And it's a very large-scale site. It was occupied during ceremonial times by tens of thousands of pilgrims. The events there were different than everyday life. They were ceremonial, and we have no idea what they were. So one of the basis for what we were doing was to build a tool that would allow the anthropologist to test hypotheses about how the site might actually have been occupied and used during these ceremonial and ritual events. So again, we used undergraduates, primarily Kristen Chow. A lot of the work was led by my then post-PhD student, Alin Normoyle. But the work here was significant because Kristen's work in this area was noticed, and she showed it to Disney, and she got a job at Disney. And her first job was doing crowd simulation at Disney. She was like vaulted to the heights in like 6 months. So then in the summer, we had a few other undergraduates helping us, including a exchange student from Caltech. All right, so if we look at what people do, if you look at like the game world, a lot of that is like one-off major, events, battles, wars, and all that. And we had done the Bauerus kind of everyday life stuff, but petrochemic was in between. This was a ceremonial, repeated, periodic event that had a lot of rules associated with which we don't know, but any kind of ritual or ceremony is always, controlled by rules. So it was that middle application that we wanted to look at. And these kinds of ceremonies are characterized by having large numbers of people, which is good for crowd simulation. And those people are either doing things or they're watching. Okay, there are observers. They're purposeful, they're organized, they're scheduled, and they're ritualized. These are often things that are not necessarily considered when you just build a crowd simulation. There are specialized events, there are group activities, and there are a lot of processional, there are a lot of marching around kind of activities and people moving from one place to another. There are also constrained variation, and this we weren't interested in, but people wearing different costumes, eating different things. So there's a lot of that low-level virtual human stuff that we didn't do that's really important. Okay, so the system we started building was called Spaces, Spatialized Performance and Ceremonial Event Simulation. And we wanted to ground this in the environment that we were given to make it parameterized for hypothesis exploration, and of course do it real time, so it was built in Unreal Engine. I apologize in advance to anyone I've left off this list. One of the advantages of retiring is I don't read as much as I used to, but there is not a lot of work in modeling crowds in cultural context. The Tallmans, both at Geneva and EPFL, have been involved in this for a long time, and some very nice work there. Probably the person who's done the most in that is Anton Bogdanovich. I advise you to look into his work. He had some quite parallel work to what we were doing. And I'm going to use one of my own students' work, No Moyle, but it's actually work she did before she became my student, so I can give her full credit for that. It has nothing to do with me. So what Spaces is about is relatively three components. They're Unreal Engine, which we rely on for all the good graphic stuff, the visual effects, the audio, the user interface. And then the anthropologist side, these are where we need specific site-specific information, and where our undergraduates had built a lot of things like the models and the people and the sounds and the behavior scripts. And what Spaces did is bring those two things together in an authoring system. There was some data collection, the player interface, and of course a camera controller because it was in 3D. But basically the work was going on in the simulation system where there was actually a time of day so you could have scheduled events and a behavior engine. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the behavior engine because we took a two-level view of this. One is that there were high-level or high-detail agents that were kind of the leaders, and Nuria knows well about this, leaders and followers. The leaders were the ones that sort of did the meaningful stuff. And then there were lightweight or stochastic agents that sort of became the background to make it look well populated. And different systems were used for those too. So of course for the leader agent, mainly these determined the path that the followers would take. And there were simple formations that were used. And I apologize for using stormtroopers instead of ethnic individuals here, but this was most efficient for them. So here's the leader and some followers. And there are different ways of setting these up so that they respected configurations. And then there were some sort of hybrid where there were clumping behaviors, and occasionally somebody gets out of line and jumps the line by proximity. But there were pretty good representations of how processions might actually proceed. The lightweight agents were done by a stochastic system, which was based on Alin's work with her initial supervisor, Alla Sofanova, before she jumped over to work with me. And this one actually had all the pieces we needed because you could set up a geometric map and annotate it with various parameters like what it was used for, how many people it could hold, how long people generally stayed in there, and all these things were distribution constraints. These were all then fed into a matrix that was used to come up with a transition graph. So I don't know how well this will show up on Zoom, but these are lightweight agents that are all respecting the constraints on how many can be in a space, that they eat at a certain time, or after they eat they want to go to an entertainment area, and they're all then controlled by these distributional parameters. Okay, so the idea here is to make a system that was highly scalable, it's parallelizable, the agents are not rigidly scripted, they can be adjusted by easily changing the distributions, for example, and yet there are these high-level individuals that could be scripted to rituals. Now let me tie this down a little closer to petrochemic and we'll finish up. So this is on the west coast. This is actually the Pacific Ocean out here. It's a huge site that's right on the edge of Lima, Peru. And to give you an idea of the scale of the site, we'll take you a quick fly through here. All the models you see were done by undergraduates in the summer, with the exception of one or two. So we're taking advantage of Unreal's daylight nighttime simulation here. There's some massive ceremonial buildings. This is the Sun Temple, looks out over the whole site. And there's some very large areas here where other things went on. There were some year-round occupants. Okay, so you get the idea. This is a map of the whole site. Most of the occupants were seasonal. There were a few like convents where people lived on site. There are literally thousands of rooms, public spaces and sacred spaces, active performers, passive audiences, scheduled activities, a lot of rituals involving dead and the oracle. So it's a very rich site. And if you populate it, at least with static individuals, you get a sense of the scale. It really was a massive site. Now, one of the things that we were interested in using here was the notion that people have roles, okay? Not to be critical, but a lot of crowd simulations are pedestrians who, wander around in spaces. Maybe they're evacuating, that's fine. Maybe they're going on transit, that's fine. But here we have a very distinct group of people who have very distinct roles. They're pilgrims, priests, guards, ACLA, fishermen, painters, field laborers, and they do specific things, are highly constrained, and they do them in specific places. So it fit exactly into that stochastic lightweight model that we had before. So that's what we did. The students built a model that gave them a web application to associate these annotations with places on the site, and those annotations semantics were transferred into Unreal Engine. Now the problem is we didn't finish the problem. So finish the system because this was done remotely in 2020 during the pandemic when nobody got together. So all of this was done remotely. It gives you a sense for the space. These passageways were deliberately very narrow so that you could do this for crowd control. You couldn't have a big group of people. It's like, you have a gate where a guard says, can you get in or not, right? And then we did show that these leader-follower animations could be transplanted into those 3D models. And you can see this really a huge site. And at the end, we got one income woman model animated into one physical model. So, all right. So I have 1 minute, I think. I'm over 1 minute. Great. So epilogue. I now mostly work for Cesium.com. You should look it up if you want. Think of Cesium as Google Earth in open source. So it's embeddable in applications. And what does this have to do with people? I can't quite tell you yet. My role there is to figure out what Cesium should do in the metaverse. And I can't yet tell you about our MIG 2022 paper, which, if it survives the present issues we're having, is relevant because it turns out it's about audiences. So although everybody thinks that people in audiences are people in audiences, it turns out that the bottom line is that there are lots of different kinds of audiences, and we're exploiting that to try to build models of what they might actually do to flesh out large-scale populations in various events. So I wish I can tell you more. Hopefully the MIG paper will actually come out. But at the moment, I have a staff of 0, so there's nothing else I can tell you about. So, all right, I need to acknowledge a lot of people. This is not all my work. And I'd like to point out that there are PhD students and postdocs. There were some faculty collaborators, lots of undergraduates, occasional master's students. But out of this list, 13 of the collaborators are women. I'm extremely proud of that we've been able to engage a lot of people in these projects for the last several years. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Norm, for the very interesting talk. Now we can move on to questions. If anybody has any questions in the audience. I can start. So all the work on simulating humans, and now at the end you just gave us 5 cents on the large virtual cities. So now putting them all together in an efficient way, in a manner that is easy to offer for non-experts, non-computer science people and so on. How far are we from, I mean, we're working a little bit on that area, but how far do you see that problem from being solved?
So I don't see it that it's a really distant problem. I feel that personally I have a lot of loose ends that I'm not going to be able to pick up, and that some of these may inspire some of you or other people to take those directions. I think some of the tools are there. Making those tools all work together is still challenging, and one of the things I hope to do at Cesium is to try to build a better integration of some of those tools. I don't know if Roland is still on Zoom, but he has a system called uCrowds, and I do believe it's somewhat public that uCrowds and AWS and Unreal and Cesium have all been in the same simulation together. But the tools to build these communities out, to build people who have roles and who have backstories and have reasons for behavior, I think are really wide open. So those are challenges that this next generation I'm encouraging them to look into. And behavior may be a bigger indicator of realism than graphics realism. That's another hypothesis that other people have tested. But a character that looks great and behaves poorly is a worse exemplar than a character that looks, let's say, stereotyped even, or less detailed, but nonetheless behaves well. And that's just how we're tuned as people.
Thank you. It was a really great presentation. At the beginning, I was like, oh my god. I don't know.
Oh, I'll repeat your question if I can.
Oh, it's fine. Because I was so much. So well, at the beginning, I was thinking, wow, you came with all these interesting like descriptions, how to incorporate personality and movement with personality. And I was like thinking, okay, well, I'm even doing my research here. It all seems already solved. Well, it's not, thankfully. But so I was thinking, all these simulations, would you say it is more for people to watch and just like to give people like a very realistic experience of how places are inhabited, and less for actually a person being there and interacting with the people, because your systems, they can't do that, can they? Like, could they, or are you also working on stuff where you can put me as the person in the system, and then I live with those people in the simulation?
So it's an excellent question. The answer is yes. We did that one summer, and I didn't show it to you.
Oh.
So we had a couple of students who built a VR application. This was with the Bauris people, so the ones sitting around the fire in the jungle, and we needed a motivator for why would you want to be there, and the motivator was sort of educational. So you would say, you know, why do you have canals, or why do you have causeways, or, you know, where do you get fish in the dry season? And those kinds of questions would then be answered in real time by the character. And the part of it that turned out for me to be the most interesting and unexpected is that we actually used a speech interface to ask these questions, because it would be very disruptive for someone to go through a menu or use a game controller to point to a question. We just wanted to just build a speech interface so that it was a natural interaction. And you couldn't ask very many questions, but it actually did work. And I think that's another area that gets into natural language understanding, and even this work that people do with DAL-E and all that, being able to ask questions and descriptions and getting responses back from that community that could actually make it engaging. And I don't want to say that's a secret approach, but I really think user experience, that you asked before, or someone else, user experience is really critical to making these things acceptable for other than the researchers who build them.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Is there any question online? No?
I will be around all day, and I'll
Yeah,
be
I
delighted
was
to
gonna
engage
check
with
whether
anybody.
There's anything. I think this is previous. Okay, I think it's nothing online. All right. So with that, thanks Norm for the
Thank you.
talk.